Here, in this chapter, we are going to talk about aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is going to help us to understand the business cycles because, as you remember from the previous chapter, we talk about aggregate demand and shifts in aggregate demand creates business cycles in the economy. So, let's first talk about Great Recession. The last quarter of 2008 was a terrible one for the US economy. Between Labor Day and New Year's Eve, nearly 2 million workers lost their jobs. A dozen car plants closed in response to a dramatic decline in car and truck sales. Even Christmas failed to bring much economic cheer in 2008. US consumers weren't spending as much as usual on holiday gifts. So, in general, US economy is in recession. Spending decreased across the board and layoffs occurred in many industries. So, what happened? Aggregate demand declined. It shifted left away from full employment GDP as the country fell into recession. To escape from recession, aggregate demand must increase. The aggregate demand curve must shift to the right toward full employment GDP. So to make it simpler, you may think that aggregate demand is the total spending inside the economy. So that will make you understand the concept of aggregate demand when you connect that aggregate demand to the recessions. So the forces of aggregate demand and aggregate supply confront each other in the marketplace. Eventually, buyers and sellers discover that only one price level and output combination is acceptable to both sides. This is the price-output combination we designate as macroequilibrium. So, at equilibrium, the rate of output equals the rate of spending, and producers have no reason to change the production level. To figure out how much consumer spend will actually happen, we need to know what fraction of disposable income will be consumed and how much will be saved. There are two ways looking at this decision. First, in terms of averages, and average propensity to consume is one of the terms we have to understand first. What is average propensity to consume? It is the proportion of total disposable income spent on consumer goods and services. And you may define average propensity to consume as an equation, which is consumption divided by disposable income. Here you have to understand the intuition behind average propensity to consume. So what does that mean? It will give you some kind of statistics, averages. In 2010, US consumers had an APC of 0.94. What does that mean? So every dollar you earn in the United States economy, average individual spends 94 cents out of this $1. And consumers saved only 6 cents of each dollar of disposable income. The second terminology we have to understand is marginal propensity to consume. MPC is the fraction of each additional dollar of disposable income spent on consumption. So it's actually another concept. That means if I additionally earn $1, how much I'm going to spend this additional dollar. So you can define MPC as change in consumption divided by change in disposable income. And MPC is not as high as APC since consumers do not respond to the next dollar earned in the same way as past dollars. As income rises, more saving can occur. Marginal propensity to save is the fraction of each additional dollar of disposable income not spent on consumption that is saved. So MPS can be defined as 1 minus MPC, and always the sum of MPC and MPS is equal to 1. The MPC and APC are simply statistical measures of observed consumer behavior. What we really want to know is that what derives these measures. So first we need to understand the determinants of consumption function. There are two determinants of consumption. The first one is autonomous consumption. The second one is income-dependent consumption. Let's first talk about autonomous consumption. The consumption function, look at the consumption function. As you see, together they make up the consumption function. Consumption is autonomous consumption plus B times disposable income. B here is the marginal propensity to consume. The consumption function allows us to predict how much the consumption component of aggregate demand will change when income changes. Here there is an example of consumption function. The 45-degree line represents all points where consumption is equal to disposable income. Autonomous consumption here can be seen on the vertical axis. Let me show you. Here is my autonomous consumption. And when consumption is less than disposable income, this saving occurs. Let me show you. This part is the this saving part. And when consumption is higher than disposable income, saving occurs. And this is the part. Okay. So this is the consumption function on the graph. Let's say there is a change in autonomous consumption. If there is a change in autonomous consumption, A is going to change. Let's say there is a decrease in A. So the consumption is going to, the consumption curve is going to drop. And as you know, autonomous consumption depends on wealth, credit, expectation, and taxes. If any of these non-income determinants change, the value of the A in the consumption function will change. Let's say one of the things, expectations change, and people lost confidence to the economy. So what is going to happen? Since people expectation gets worse, this would decrease the consumption. Only the autonomous part is going to be affected, and this will decrease all consumption. Reduced consumption would lead to a shift of aggregate demand to the left, and vice versa applies. Let me show you here. So here, I know that, let me write it again, aggregate demand curve is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So what happens, especially this is the case, what happens during the recession? Consumption decreased. Why? Because of the decrease in the confidence to the economy. So what happened? Consumption decreased. Since consumption decreased, this whole equation should decrease, which will affect the aggregate demand curve to decrease. Let's say before the recession, the economy is at an equilibrium, and that equilibrium at full employment level, okay? And now this is my aggregate demand curve, and this is my aggregate supply. And since now, because consumption decreases, aggregate demand curve, which is total spending, is going to decrease. A decrease in total spending will be reflected on the graph as a shift of aggregate demand curve to the left. Here, as you see, there is a new equilibrium, but at that equilibrium, you'll realize that there is going to be an unemployment, which is through the recession, the unemployment rate increased to 10%. Why? Because the economy is not producing at its full capacity. Like this example, anything that changes the consumption will change the aggregate demand curve. What are these? Income, expectations, wealth, credit conditions, tax policy. In 2008-2009, home equity fell and consumer confidence fell. Aggregate demand shifted left, resulting in the Great Recession. Shifts in aggregate demand can be a cause of macro instability. The second component of aggregate demand is investment. What is investment? Investment is expenditures on new plants, equipment, and structures, plus changes in inventories. You may think investment is like buying a computer to school labs. It's an investment because now you are actually investing for the education that you are earning money. So from that perspective, expectations are very important for investment. Favorable expectations of future sales are necessary for investment spending. And no firm wants to purchase a new plant and equipment unless it's convinced people will later buy the output produced by that plant and that equipment. And the second thing that affects the investment is the interest rate. Investment spending is inversely related to the interest rate. The higher the rate of interest, the costlier it is to invest. We anticipate a lower rate of investment spending when interest rates are high and more investment at lower rates. And the third determinant of investment is technological advances that stimulate the investment spending. Let's see how investment function looks like. As you see, investment function is a line on the graph where on the vertical axis there is interest rate and on the horizontal axis there is planned investment spending. And investment spending is inversely related to interest rate. So this is actually maybe confusing the first time you see it, but think of that. Are you going to buy a home if the interest rate is 1% or if the interest rate is 10%? So as you see, if we accept home as an investment, decrease in the interest rate will promote the sales in the home industry. If expectations of future sales improve, the investment function shifts right, as will aggregate demand curve. Let's see on the example again. Here we say that there is positive expectations. You have positive expectations, so your expectations are increasing for the economy. As an investor, you are going to increase your investment because you know that you are going to sell in the future a lot. So what is going to happen? Since aggregate demand curve can be written as consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, an increase in investment will increase the aggregate demand curve. And let's see it on the graph. We will start with the equilibrium first, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and let's say the economy is at an equilibrium. And since there is an increase in the investment, aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. So the economy will produce more goods and services. Okay? Let's say this is AD1. So the third component is government spending. When I say government spending, you may think about increased spending on national defense, increased construction of roads, parks. These are all government spending. Because of balanced budget requirements, state and local spending will decrease when consumption and investment spending decrease. This contributes to instability. Because of deficit spending, federal spending can be increased to counter spending decreases in other components. This is the basis of the Keynesian demand policy. What I'm trying to say in this slide, here is again our aggregate demand curve, which is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. Let's say the economy goes into recession and we see that there's a decrease in private consumption and investment spending. So in order to compensate this decrease, what we can do as a policy, we can increase the government spending so that the decrease in consumption and investment will be compensated by government spending and aggregate demand curve doesn't shift. So we can get rid of the recession, okay? This is the idea of Keynes actually. Keynes is saying if there is a recession, the economy is not going to self-adjust. What you have to do is you have to increase the government spending so that you can take the economy out of recession. The fourth component is net exports. Economic downturns in other lands lead to a decrease in U.S. exports and vice versa. Economic downturns in the U.S. lead to a decrease in U.S. imports. If net export decreases, aggregate demand shifts left. If net export increases, aggregate demand shifts right. Think of this case as like aggregate demand is the total spending of not only domestic consumers but also foreigners who are buying American goods too. So if there is some kind of recession happen outside the United States, let's say there is a recession in Europe, what's going to happen? The European consumers are not going to buy any more iPads, iPhones, so which will affect the total goods produced inside the country. So as you see, anything that happens bad outside affecting consumption will affect the aggregate demand total spending inside the country. So let's look at, after understanding the aggregate demand curve, let's look at the equilibrium again. Okay, we want to be at equilibrium, but not all equilibrium is desirable. The desirable equilibrium is at a point where you have full employment level. That means full employment output level is the level that you use all your capacity of your economy to produce goods and services. But as you see in case B, there is unemployment. Why? Because there is again an equilibrium, but at that equilibrium, the economy is producing below its capacity. In case C, there is inflation. Why? Because people want to spend more than the economy can produce, which will actually increase the price level in the country, so that there is going to be a pressure in the prices, which will create inflation in the economy. So what we do, we want to shift in these B and C, we want to shift the aggregate demand curve such that we get into the full employment level. In the following chapters, we are going to understand what can be do as a policy to shift the aggregate demand curve so that we get into full employment level. Let's talk about macro failure. Two concerns about macro equilibrium. Macro equilibrium might not give us full employment or price stability. Even when macro equilibrium is perfectly positioned, it may not last. So equilibrium with cyclical unemployment occurs with a recessionary GDP gap. Equilibrium with demand pull inflation occurs with an inflationary GDP gap. And the last part, you can be able to see on the graph this recessionary GDP gap. At recessionary GDP gap, as you see here, we are at an equilibrium, but this equilibrium is less than less than the full employment level. So the difference in output is going to be reflected in the labor market, and there is going to be an unemployment, and this unemployment is called cyclical unemployment. Look at the inflationary GDP gap. In inflationary GDP gap, the economy wants to spend at an output level which is higher than the full employment level. Inventories are going to be depleted. So what's going to happen? The prices of the goods and services are going to increase, and there is going to be pressure on the prices, which will create inflation.